This is going to be a four-part series called The Lying Pen of the Scribes. I need to start with my usual disclaimer that I'm not an official spokesman for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm simply a person who studied the doctrine a little bit, and so I'll present things that I believe and hope are accurate. Also, we'll be dealing then with some of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, I know that not everybody that watches these videos is going to be a Hebraist. A few will be, and so we will try to put up some slides or some visual aids to help with the Hebrew. If you don't understand any Hebrew, that's perfectly all right. Hopefully you'll still get something out of these brief lectures. The first section, to kind of introduce the topic, the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the official name, and the members, the Latter-day Saints, subscribe to articles of faith that kind of summarize the religious tenets, and there are 13 such articles of faith. And article number 8 states in part, "We believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly." Now, it's well known that translations are never completely faithful to the original. Indeed, that is impossible because there is no one-to-one correspondence between any two languages. Now, some languages seem to come close because the language developed from common roots. This would be true, for instance, of French and English, where there's a fairly close correspondence for much of the vocabulary. It really isn't true at all, though, for languages that are in completely different families. English and Hebrew, for example. And so there's a lot of difficulty in choosing the right words and the right syntax when translating from Hebrew to English or vice versa. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that anciently, of course, copies were made by scribes who would sit around and look at one copy of a manuscript or text and then try to copy down the words, but sometimes they made mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes were mistakes, in other words, accidental. Sometimes they were intentional. Now, these intentional changes were made because these scribes felt like perhaps, well, the text must be wrong. It's not, it didn't coincide with their concepts of the theology involved. And I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. So they would sometimes tweak the text a little bit. Now, these scribal corrections are referred to in Hebrew. We use the term tikkunei sofrim, means scribal corrections. And the prophet Jeremiah was especially aware of this. So in chapter 8 of Jeremiah and in verse 8, we have this message. Now I'm going to read it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it into English. I don't know exactly what the King James has. I remember looking at it once upon a time and thinking it really isn't clear what Jeremiah was trying to say in the King James version. But let's start with the Hebrew. And the Hebrew reads like this: Echat tomru chachamim anachnu v'torat Adonai itanu. Achen hine lasheker asa 8 sheker sofrim. Now, this could be translated as, how do you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us? Surely, behold, the lying pen of the scribes have turned it, meaning the law, the Torah, into a lie. But since the word Lord is actually a euphemism for the divine name, the Yud He Vav He, which modern scholars will frequently call Yahweh, due to the influence of the Luther translation and the German tradition. In English, we've adopted the word, at least in the King James Version, Jehovah, for this divine name. And now Latter-day Saints further believe that this Jehovah or Yahweh was actually the Son of God, the Son of the Father, and he was the one who dealt with Abraham and his descendants. In other words, that it was the one who was this Yahweh or Jehovah, meaning the God of Israel. And another thing I should tell you about this, because this is going to be of special interest, I think, to Latter-day Saints, and that is that the word Torah, we think of it as law, but a law, particularly in modern Hebrew, would probably be more chok than Torah. Torah comes from a root which means instruction, and because it's instruction from God, or from the Lord being the euphemism for the divine name. And in some modern Hebrew dictionaries, if you look up the word gospel, for instance, now the gospel in modern Hebrew, the word that's usually used is besorah. But Torah, for instance, the Zilberman dictionary is translated, one of the translations for it is gospel. So Torah is the instruction that comes from somebody, and Latter-day Saints use the term gospel to mean the body of instructions given to man by our Heavenly Father through His Son. Now, with that in mind, we could translate this a little differently. We could say, it could be, how do you say we are wise and we have the gospel of Christ? Okay, that may be extreme for some people, but it actually would fit well with LDS theology. If you prefer, we can say, and we have the instruction of Yahweh. Both of those, the latter would be a more literal translation. The former, though, would be true to the message, perhaps, at least in the eyes of Latter-day Saints. To continue, surely behold, the lying pen of the scribes has turned it into a lie. Now, the Hebrew there is a little bit tricky, so I'm going to talk about that for just a minute. Okay, on the board here I've written, now this is cursive Hebrew, and even Hebraists in the early stages frequently aren't familiar, particularly those who have studied only biblical Hebrew are often not familiar with cursive Hebrew that's used today. So we'll put up some slides in this video to show it in the printed Hebrew as we go along. But this is l'sheker, as a lie, asa, it has made. And then, et sheker sofrim, the lying pen of the scribes. Now, in the Masoretic text, now the Masoretic text is the standard Hebrew version from which we make our English translations. And I'll be talking about that at another point in time. But there are footnotes in the bottom of the official, I don't know if you could call it official, but the standardized text is called the Biblia Stuttgartensia. There are footnotes, and there's a footnote to this word, asa, that it should be written or read as though it had a dot in it. Right there, that final letter, which is a hey, is supposed to be pronounced because it's got a dot in it. Now that changes the meaning a little bit, because what it means is that word now contains, it's not just it made, it meaning the line pin of the scribes is the subject, but now it shows that verb made, which is a transitive verb, has a direct object, and that direct object is feminine and singular. It's not just asa, but it's asah. Well, maybe a little softer than that. Meaning made it, meaning made the Torah of the Lord, the Torah of Yahweh, turned it, the Torah, into a lie. That's what the line pin of the scribes has done. Now, for this first segment, I'm going to show you one example of what I'm talking about. If you look for translations of the Bible in English, you look at some of the new ones. Now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for the English speakers, still uses the King James Version. And I don't know exactly what the reason is, but I have a suspicion it may be related to the fact that the King James Version actually has what they call a higher Christology. More modern versions are frequently translations made by people who don't really believe that ancient prophets could have known things that were going to happen in the future, and that affects the way they translate. So, one of the verses that I'm going to look at when somebody brings out an English translation of the Bible is Zechariah chapter 13, verse 6. In the King James Version, this reads, "What are these wounds in thine hands? And then the answer is, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Okay, as that is translated, you see that could be a reference to Christ, because who had wounds in his hands, and who got them in the house, meaning the general congregation of his friends. It was Christ. He got them among his friends and relatives. So that appears to be a Christological reference. Now, let's look at a newer version, and this is the New International Version, which reads, and we'll put up slides for this too, "What are these wounds on your body?" The answer is, "The wounds I was given at the house of my friends." Well, all of a sudden you see that's no longer a reference to Christ, because the wounds are not in his hands anymore, are they? They're in his body. Let me tell you why that was made. The word in Hebrew, the phrase is bein hayadayim, or bein yadecha. Bein, the word bein, is usually translated as between. And I can't offhand think of a dictionary that might tell you this, but there was a time when it actually could mean within. Actually, the Brown Driver Briggs, which is a dictionary that many Bible scholars use, does mention that possibility, that it can mean between, and because it can mean between, it can actually mean, because it mean within, it can mean in. In other words, within your hands. This would be a legitimate translation of bein, and that's where the King James scholars went with it. It's bein hayadayim. It's within your hands, in your hands. Modern scholars, particularly those who are not really comfortable with Hebrew, I think, or don't know some of the history of it, would look at bein and they'd say, okay, bein yadayim would have to be between your hands. Well, what's between your hands? Here's a hand, your body's in between the two. And so, he must be saying they're in your body. Well, if the prophet had wanted to say they're in your body, he would have said baguf. Okay, guf is the word for body, but he didn't. But nevertheless, I suspect that's the reasoning. So that's how we end up with that odd thing. But now it's no longer a Christological reference. Let's look at another one. The Living Bible says, then what are these scars on your chest and your back? This is a very liberal translation. The answer, I got into a brawl at the house of a friend. Okay, this isn't Christ at all, is it? You know, he didn't get into a fist fight. You know, he didn't have these scars on his chest and his back, unless... this is certainly not Bain the Yadayim in the hands. So this removes any possible connection to Christ, which is part of a general trend amongst modern translators. Finally, we'll go to the New English Bible, which reads, what are these scars on your chest? See, it's the same thing, Bain between the... The answer is, I got them in the house of my lovers. Mahavai is the word that he's translating as lovers. But the Mahavai are the people who love me. And we talk about Christian love. And so that's why other people like the King James translators may translate friends, those who love me, those who care about me. So this is a philos, this is not an eros, you see. So this is in the house of my lovers does not work for that. Therefore, the theology that then comes out of these new translations is very much affected by the doctrinal prejudice of the translators. Thank you.